welcome to Kids Talk Back, a return to civil discourse. I am Dr. Edward Grippy, a professor of ethics and philosophy at Norwalk Community College. Today's topic will be free speech on college campuses. I'm surrounded by a group of intelligent and wonderful young people, and they are...
Hi, I'm Hallie and I'm 12 years old.
I'm Anna and I'm 18.
I'm Nathaniel and I'm 13.
I'm Hannah, I'm 19.
I'm Eliana, I'm 16.
I'm Haven, I'm 15.
And this is going to be a dialogue, hearkening back to the Socratic method. Rather than a debate, we're going to have a discussion, hence the idea of civil discourse. It is not the idea of trying to win, but trying to seek the truth. And so, with that in mind, let us begin. So, the free speech, First Amendment right, seems to be an excellent place to start. What do you think is the limits of free speech as well as the extent of it? So, who would like to start?
I'll go. So I think that free speech is very, very broad, and a lot of people, includes a lot of things except hate speech, and that's a big thing in this debate, is where do you draw the line with hate speech? And hate speech, does it have to indirectly harm people, directly harm people? And that's what is going to be important in drawing the line. And
Okay. Mm-hmm. Somebody want to go and speak to what they think hate speech is and isn't?
Yeah, it's hard. I think that one of the major things that creates hate speech is this incitement to violence in some way, or it could be interpreted in a different way of what makes someone emotionally uncomfortable, or in this case on college campuses, feel as if they aren't safe in what essentially has become their home during these years. So I think that's another part to consider, is that hate speech is a very difficult thing to define. Mm-hmm. But once you consider whether it's having a psychological impact on someone or inciting someone to harm people in that way, I think that's where hate speech becomes more physical, affecting the people.
Okay, so it would be the idea of harming. Now that could be rather subjective. For example, being a philosopher, one of my jobs is to make people uncomfortable. So, to what extent, emotionally uncomfortableness is going to be a problem? If a person thinks, for example, that a challenge is something that shouldn't be done because they don't think that they should be, their beliefs should be, or values should be questioned. Is that hate speech, or does it go, to a different route?
Can I add on to that? One thing that I think is important about the concept of hate speech is that it's partially, like you said, subjective, but also situational. And I think it depends where you are and the kind of audience that you have. It's not going to be the same thing across the board. One audience might be uncomfortable with a certain topic, and that would be legitimately challenging, maybe, or else another audience is uncomfortable because it really is something deeply offensive to a certain group of people. So I think it depends on the environment, and also it's important to consider that colleges are, like you were saying, supposed to be challenging, and that can make people uncomfortable. So that's just one other thing to figure in, is that it can vary depending on the situation. So
how does one decide the situation? If you're in a college, in a college classroom, for example, or on the quad, or at maybe a demonstration, somebody might be offended at almost anything that somebody else says. So it would seem that we have to be rather clear about what we mean by making somebody emotionally uncomfortable. Violence is another matter. That is pretty cut and dry usually. All right, but the idea of dissent is meant to go and challenge a preconception, an idea, a policy. So how do we start working that through?
It's interesting because I think, if you guys don't mind, I think that there is a difference between, let's say, being uncomfortable or disagreeing with an opinion that might make me uncomfortable, and those are policies that I think are have less of a psychological harmful impact on people than saying I'm intolerant of who you identify as or who you are. And I think that's where the harm starts to come to the individuals, when they feel as if they're walking down, let's say, the campus, and they're walking past a speech that's saying that they shouldn't be at this college or they shouldn't be on the planet, is really something that starts to affect themselves and how they feel on their day-to-day activities around campus and in their life. And I think that's very different from disagreeing, say, on an economic policy that's being discussed on the campus or something. So I think that part of the situational thing that Anna brought up is if they're talking about who people are and who they identify as, and condemning an entire group of people, or whether it's talking more policy based and about a real discussion rather than just rhetoric being used. If that makes sense.
It depends how the person is speaking as well. Like, this is civil discourse, and if a person is being civil and is presenting their opinions in a respectful way, then that's probably not going to be as offensive just because they're being respectful of different kinds of people. But at the same time, then it allows for exchange of ideas instead of actually coming out on the offense and saying things that are really going to offend people. If somebody is actually stating their opinions in a civil way, then there's probably not going to be as much issue with the concept of hate speech, because at least they're being respectful as they're giving their opinions.
Right, and as long as the opinions don't really incite violence or like
Antagonize someone.
Yeah, antagonize someone emotionally or something. It really, like, it's kind of up to the person whether they're going to be offended. So it kind of matters. Like, people will always be offended, and if you say something that people disagree with, that could either be offensive or upsetting because you disagree with that. But that's like civil discourse. That's, you have to express your ideas. When the line gets when it goes over the line is when it's inciting violence, hurting someone, indirectly or directly.
If I may, I think it's an interesting question, though, to consider what does it mean to incite violence through speech? Because a lot of the times it's not just, saying, oh, we should harm these people. It's not so explicit.
Sure.
So, and I think that's where the line gets blurred a lot of the time on college campuses, is when a speaker is thought by many to be provoking, hateful thoughts or speech, but when it's not directly linked to action, does the school still have a responsibility to curtail that, or is it too premature?
And also, language is so complex. There are so many different elements to it. You could say one thing and mean something completely different. So.
Well, that's where I guess discourse should come in, but of course if you say something and somebody immediately takes offense because of their subjective ideas, it might actually devolve rather quickly. So the idea again is that we don't want to offend, but do we want to go and then get frozen by the idea of being PC, politically correct?
Right.
I think that one of the things is that you can, being offensive doesn't always have to link to having that psychological harm on someone, if that makes sense, because I can be offended by very many things, but very few of them actually have an impact on how I feel or how I live my life. So I think that a lot of people find policies or sentences that are, just said by these people during their speeches, they find them offensive, but I think that's different. Once again, it's to the group that's being targeted, right? So if someone goes to, let's say, someone's going to a predominantly religious or Christian school and is talking about their pro-abortion or pro-choice kind of policies, that would offend them, and I think they would also feel personally affected, but not to the same level that it would impact, say, someone going to a predominantly black college and talking about how they should restore, an all-white nation or something like that. So that's
Right.
But isn't the idea of freedom of speech should allow somebody who maybe is not going to use, say, the N-word, which I think is what we're trying to get across as being harmful, but what if a person actually says that they believe that the country was founded, and this is the issue that happened at Berkeley, it was founded, or was going to happen, it was founded by white people, and there is these white Christian ideals that we should go and live up to, and we should go and not allow for the race to be spoiled. Now, do we stop that kind of speech? Because I am sure somebody's being offended by it.
Well,
So that can also.
I'm sorry. You go, guys.
No, it's all right.
I mean, I was just going to say, I'm sort of two minds of this, because on one hand, I think it's valuable to have these provoking opinions or opinions that you may vehemently disagree with, because I think that is one way that you can go about changing those ideas or attacking those opinions, is to first hear them, understand them, and then attack them.
Exactly.
And I think that's valuable for college students in particular, to sort of get out of a
Yeah,
bubble
bubble.
and realize what other people are thinking. But on the other hand, I do wonder what the school's responsibility is in terms of allowing these speakers, if they are threatening their students, like minority students specifically, then what is the college's role in protecting their physical and emotional safety?
I also think it depends a little bit on context,
Mm-hmm.
because if you're speaking your beliefs, if you think we should restore the nation to an all-white nation, you can be in public just stating your beliefs, or you can go to a black church and say that, and it depends on what you're trying to do with it. You know what I mean?
Kind of. Go on.
No.
Okay. Kind of bouncing off of that point, though, doesn't free speech itself kind of depend on context? Like, if I'm saying that to an entire college, like, I know if I'm saying something that's going to incite violence or something to an entire college, I know that it's going to, it could, and it has the possibility of leading to something violent. However, if I say that or murmur that to myself, to a relative, or murmur it to myself while I'm in my house and no one can hear me, does that really count?
It depends on, if you go, for example, like you were saying, and if you go to a black church and you say we should restore the nation to an all-white nation, then you're going there purposefully with the intent of offending somebody. Like, there's no way that you're
Right.
doing that thinking, oh no, I'm completely peaceful, but you should all get out of my nation. That doesn't make a lot of
If you have an
sense.
intent to harm.
Right, there's an intent there that's not civil.
It's like
Whereas-
yelling fire in a crowded theater,
Yeah.
Okay, but is that the case? I mean, if we're talking about civil discourse, shouldn't a person be getting down to exactly what they believe if reason is somehow involved in the exchange? If it is just an emotional, throwing back and forth of ideas, well, not even ideas, again, it's something like emotional gut reactions, then people will be talking past each other. It's in ethics, it's called emotivism, where you don't really speak to each other. But the idea that what if somebody came and said, this is what I truly believe, shouldn't it come down to, well, wait, I want to go and challenge you on that. For example, I was thinking of our beginnings of our country. I mean, wow. Patrick Henry is saying, give me liberty or give me death, and there was not exactly nice things said about the king, of course. Then the King of England, George III, decided to try to stop it. But was Patrick Henry inciting to violence and yet still exercising freedom of speech?
I think it's possible to do both at the same time in some situations. I think it's possible, especially in his situation, he is speaking freely to his own people, and it was something that was meant to be heard in England. It was a cry for freedom that was supposed to be heard by the king. Like, it was sort of shouting in his face, but at the same time, he was talking to people who he was trying to inflame with this want of liberty for the country. So he kind of, it's in some ways it's both, but I think that's also a slightly different situation, because in that situation, the country actually went to war. It was a issue between multiple countries.
No, actually.
Well-
it was between the colony of a country and
Yeah.
its established government.
But I mean, like, it became a country. It was a larger thing than if a speaker comes to a college campus and says the same thing. That's a slightly different situation.
Well, then I have a problem. I'm being older and having a little bit more experience through the historical development in the United States. The Black Panther Party wanted to go and establish a separate country, so that they would not go and suffer the racism, and they thought that there was no way to get around it in the United States, so they wanted to establish a separate country. Of course, people then said, well, that's a problem, and the FBI made sure that that didn't happen. I'm a little confused now, and it's okay to be confused, by the way. I'm a little confused by the idea here is that we have to not make people uncomfortable, yet we laud Patrick Henry as a patriot, and we condemn, Huey Newton perhaps as a radical.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it kind of depends on context almost. Like if they were patriots and they were being oppressed by England, wouldn't that kind of provide like an incentive to?
Well, I think that the problem is that people can think that they're oppressed in their own ways, and that's where their speech comes from. And I think that's why it's difficult, because also no one really, like you were saying, no one's really, or very few people look for the discourse or look for opinions that are contrary to their own. So freedom of speech that's to some point inciting something or some sort of uncomfortable feeling is necessary to create a broader idea and a broader understanding, like you said, of either your own opinions or of theirs. So I think that's where it's tricky, but my question is rather, are college campuses the best place to demonstrate, this freedom of speech, or do they have more of a duty to protecting the students physically or emotionally, or do they have more of a duty to broaden the horizon, so to speak?
Yes.
And, yeah.
it's both.
Yeah.
Being on college campus for about 20 years and adjuncted before that, the idea is that you don't want to harm, but you do want to go and challenge, and the complacency and the values and beliefs that haven't been thought through, I would go and argue, given my profession, need to be challenged, and that makes people uncomfortable. But let me see if I could throw in a little bit of help here. So Immanuel Kant, a fantastic philosopher, who I love because he started his real deep philosophy in the age of 56 and continued, and that makes me feel better. But the idea is that he came up with two categorical imperatives. The first one is that if you can universalize something in your actions, then it is moral. Why? Because if I steal from you, but I don't want you to steal from me, I can't universalize it. The second categorical imperative, and this one is rather important, treat yourself and everybody else never merely as means, but always as an end. Meaning, for example, if you go over to Hannaford's and you go up to the counter and the person behind the counter checking out your food is acting slowly, you get upset and treat them as if they were an extension of the cash register rather than as a person. You're treating them merely as a means. If somebody gives you a cat call, for example, treats you, I'm not sure they'll give you a cat call, but anyway, gives a cat call out and treats you merely as a sexual object. That is treating you merely as a means and not as an end. So perhaps with that in mind, maybe we could start to unravel some of these problems. Are people who may become even to a traditionally black church and expressing their opinion, are they treating the people in the pews merely as a means and not as an end, or are they trying to engage them as people?
Yeah, definitely. I think that they're treating them as a means to an end in that sense, because clearly I don't think that they're truly expecting a black community to say, oh, you're completely right, we're subpar humans. I think that in that way it's why people talk, scandalous remarks and such provoking words that are used is to get that attention, to have that spotlight, to be able to find the people that do agree with them. So I think that they are treating them.
But that might have been a straw man argument that you did. The straw man argument is making the other side rather weak to win the argument. So that you have the idea, maybe that person, like you said, it had to do with intent. Maybe the person came in there and is really trying to be a little more subtle. I'm not defending this, but I'm going to argue for this. This is the power of doing philosophy. The idea that, hold on now, it seems that if you look around, like the Commonwealth of England and here in the United States, we have pretty solid governments, whereas other people have dictatorships and all that. And maybe there's some value in the traditionally Northern European democratic ideals, which happen to be, people with white skin, sort of brings that there, where other people of other, colors do not. Now, of course, one could argue against that, but can a person actually say that, even in an audience that might be hostile to his expression?
Well,
That's-
I think,
Especially at a college.
right.
And treating people as means and not ends, I think it goes both ways. I think a lot of the times these speakers who act as like provocateurs, they do treat their audience as a means to an end in terms of, you know, they might want to incite something or shock them and not necessarily treat them, you know, as you know, an audience where they can engage civilly. I think the audience, especially at college campuses, also does the same thing to the speaker, and a lot of the times where they may demonize them or have a visceral reaction without sort of creating the proper avenue for civil discourse. Sort of like both sides aren't really interested, I think, a lot of the times in actually discussing the issues. I don't think there's a good avenue set up for a back and forth between the speaker and an audience where they can question it. I think that's really interesting. I love that.
One thing I would add is, like you were saying, the argument about like Western government kind of being something that is brought by white people and therefore better, or not necessarily better because it's brought by white people, but something better that is often brought by white people. You were summing up that argument that could be used. Is a little bit different than going into, say, a black church, using the example, and saying something like, you all need to get out of our country because you are subpar humans, like Haven was saying, is a little bit different than arguing for a certain type of government, because then you're not arguing against the particular type of people. You're just saying this is a different kind of government. And correct me if I'm interpreting your argument wrong, but I think that that's a little bit different than doing something that's not with as much intent to actually go insult people, depending on the person, obviously, as someone who went into a black church and said, like, black people are terrible and you shouldn't be here. Right. Something like that would actually be really offensive to the people in that church. It would make an impact, and it would definitely antagonize people, like you were saying, which is a little bit different than arguing in a different way.
But just back to the college points, what if, like, are the speakers at college campuses, are they going to do any harm? Do they incite violence? Is someone that is, like, brought by a college, would they incite violence? And that's, like, the question that needs to be answered here. Are they an antagonistic hate, and are they speaking hate speech, or do they just have an opinion? Like, are the people at colleges that are speaking really inciting violence?
We've seen on both ends, like, let's say even before, like at Berkeley, like even before a speaker arrives to the college, there's violence that occurs in protest or some form of that. So it definitely happens on both ends, or vice versa. You know, if they say something like what we've been saying, but to shake it up a little bit, you know, like women are all weak and they are the inferior race or something like that. Race, you know, sex, gender. It's on my mind. So that could also incite violence to the individual. So I think that there is, as long as there's a possibility of anyone being physically harmed, at least. That.
But I think it's a slippery slope to, you know, sort of have that, when you make such an indirect link between someone's words and action. I think that's why the courts have had such a hard time ruling on hate speech, is because you really want to, you know, look at people for their actions, and it gets very difficult when you start trying to police what's in their heads or even what comes out of their mouths, unless it's a direct incitement, like an order or a real call to action.
And people are responsible for their own actions as well.
Right, and I don't know if we want to set that precedent, you know, of, you know, trying to police what, you know, your opinions are.
I think what we're witnessing here is a complete standstill between two people, and I think it's almost a human instinct to not want to hear a different idea. It makes us uncomfortable. It makes us, like, you know, when you were a kid and you went like this, I'm not going to listen to what you're saying. Yeah. It's kind of like,
want to be challenged.
Yeah, it's a more, you don't want to be challenged. You want to believe that what you've been believing all this time and what you've fought for and what you've voted for is correct. And you're witnessing a complete standstill with people that don't want to hear that their opinion is wrong, and that's what's preventing a good discussion and
in a way,
nonviolent discussion.
In a way, all of this rioting and opposition like that, I'm not going to hear it, actually indicates or could indicate like a weak persuasive value.
If you're more if you're more confident in your own idea, you'll be more comfortable listening to opposing views, because you'll know, like you were saying earlier, you'll know how to fight them and dismantle them if you really believe they're wrong. But also, it can make you more convicted of why you believe what you believe.
Exactly.
If you can hear that, now we're going to have to wrap this up shortly, But the second topic that we might want to talk about is confirmation bias, the problem of actually people hearing the other, and the other person could be presenting it rationally, but they interpret it as, no, this is just has to be wrong. And the more you present it rationally, the more they say it's wrong. This happens not only with, say, conservative thinking, but also with liberal thinking. I happen to have a neighbor who sometimes thinks that way. But, but the idea here is that we, the group, seem to be, leaning in a certain direction. Well, have we challenged ourselves personally about the things that we hope are true? Because if you automatically cut off the other, as you were saying, then there is no learning. And yet there is this whole idea that we could have, the other side where then you're not listening. Aristotle has the idea of a golden mean. I don't know if you ever heard of that before. You did, good. So the idea that there are two wrongs, excess and lack, whereas those are vices, whereas you want to find the golden mean. And I think that is the hardest thing to do in life, and especially here in the idea of having civil discourse. Now nobody hit me, so I appreciate that, and I didn't hit anybody. So quick last word if you want, because we have a little time left, just a tiny bit.
I just want to say it's just interesting, the whole idea of having these speakers on the college campuses, just considering that so much of an individual's political socialization comes from one neighborhood or one school or their family in this area. So I think it's interesting. I do think at the end of the day it's for the best, or to have these people exposed to these ideas one way or the other.
Exactly.
And then, is it the college's job to challenge and educate, and or have the students have a sense of security and safety?
Right.
I think above everything else, it's each person's job to just be civil and understanding to everyone else, because people are in a way slaves to what they believe is right or wrong. They can choose their opinions, but they can't really, because they choose it based on what they think is right or wrong. So to condemn someone else for their opinion isn't really fair. I think that you could have been him, so it's do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. I mean, I think everything you do to someone else, I think eventually it'll come back to bite you in some form or another.
Well, that's a whole other topic, but thank you very much. I had the opinion as we began that this is an intelligent group, and you've only convinced me of that more. So this has been Kids Talk Back, a return to civil discourse, and we just had some. Thank you very much.